is a very unique system from Ryder Games. You gotta have the core box in order to play it, but you need more than just the core box. In addition to the core box, which will run you $20 from your friendly local game store, you have to have at least one feature box. And the reason that there's no lid on this box right now on either side is because the game board comes from the feature. The killer board is one side of that box, and the location board is the other side of this box. It's a completely modular system. They call it their feature film system. And it's modular because you can mix and match a different killer and a different location and a different final girl. You get to play with one final girl. You get two final girls come in each feature box. You get to pick which final girl you want to play with. You get to pick which killer you're trying to fight against, which map you are dealing with them on. That's a little bit about what this game is. Why don't we talk about how this game is played? So during the setup, I went ahead and I did the setup already, but this comes in the core box, this little board down here. This is my Final Girl board. Final Girl card came with the Intruders and Wingard Cottage. Those two boards are, like I mentioned, from the box. All of these little pieces, most of these little pieces come in the core box, that's why you gotta have it. There's also an entire deck of action cards that I have a tableau of action cards over on this side of the board, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I have a hand of 6 action cards that I get to start with. During the setup, I dealt myself a random setup card up here and set up the game board based off of that. There are 4 item cards that have been randomly dealt from a deck of items that came with the location to 3 different locations. So there's 4 different items in each of those 3 different locations. If I want to go looking for stuff that I can use to help me defeat these killers. Because I am facing the Intruders, I am up against 3 killers. They all start in the same location, but they will move independent of one another and attack independent of one another as well. There's a deck of terror cards. Some of these cards come from the killer, some of these cards come from the location. So during your setup and tear down, you gotta separate them out when you tear it down and put it away, because if you want to mix and match, then you'll shuffle your killer terror cards with your location terror cards and then deal out 10 of them to form your terror deck for the game. There are also 2, kind of hard to see here, these are cards right here. This one is the killer's finale card, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. And this one is their dark power card. And we'll talk about both of those later on. Right now they start face down on the game board. Eventually, most likely both of them will flip face up, and it'll be bad news for the final girl. Also, there is a deck of event cards that is based off of the location. Those are all shuffled and set out. Because of the fact that I am using Wingard Cottage, there's special rules for each killer and location that you got to take a look at. And for the special rules for the Intruders, it's basically just talking about the fact that there's 3 killers instead of just 1. And they all have less health than a single killer would have, and you'll see how they move. That's pretty easy to follow. But as far as Wingard Cottage goes, what's special about this location is that there are craftable items all the way over on, I think, is it that button? Yeah, over in this corner, I've got 4 component items that I can search for instead of the stuff that I talked about earlier that's been dealt out. I can search for these components, and then once I get the correct components from these 4 plus stuff that could be in the regular item deck, I can craft one of these 4 randomly dealt crafted item cards to be used to deal some nasty stuff. These black health tokens, the final girl gets 1, the killer gets 1, and since there's 3 killers, each killer gets 1. These all look the same on this side of the token, but on the other side, there is a random health value from 0 to 3. We'll talk about why that is important later. There are 9 of these tokens in the box, and I had to shuffle them all up and deal them out at random, and I have not looked at the other side of those tokens because I should not know what they think. So, that's the gist of the setup that has already been covered. Now, let's talk about the shape of the game. The game is played over a series of turns or rounds, is what I'm going to call them, because the final girl gets a turn, and then the killer gets a turn, and then there's some cleanup stuff, and then we go again. But the rule book refers to them as phases, which you can kind of see on that board right there. 5 different phases to each turn or round. During the action phase, I get to play cards from my hand. Like I mentioned, I get these 6 cards to start with. I know that these are my starter cards because they have a little 0 time cost down there in the bottom right. So I started with these 6 cards in my hand. During the action phase, I can choose to play action cards and then do whatever, resolve them accordingly. Now, I'm going to come over to the tableau with the camera feed. You'll see on these action cards, most of them have a little rundown of like 3 or 4 icons here. That is because when I play an action card, I'm going to come back over here. When I play an action card, I have to roll, most of the time, I will have to roll some of these horror dice. Right here. I've got 6 of them. Most of the time I'm not going to get to roll nearly that many. At the start of the game, the horror level is at 3 because that's what the Intruder's game board says right there. Horror level is at 3 on this board, which means whenever I make a horror roll, my base roll amount is I get to roll 2 dice. I might be able to augment that with certain items or action cards or something where I can add dice to that or something. But my base level, to start the game, I get to roll 2 dice. If I can lower that horror level down to 1, I can roll 3, or even lower, I can roll 3. If it gets all the way up here, my base number of dice I roll is only 1. At the start of the game, I'm rolling 2 dice. When I roll these dice, let's come down here real quick. Let's say I'm playing this walk card. I roll these dice, and that was a really good roll. On a 5 or a 6, you've got a success. And you're looking for successes over here on the left side of the card. On a 1 or a 2, you got a fail. That's no bueno. That means I got no successes. On a 3 or a 4, I've got what the rulebook defines as a partial success. A partial success means it's a failure unless I opt to discard 2 cards from my hand. If I discard 2 cards from my hand, I can turn one of those partial successes into a success. Then it's an actual success and it's not a failure. If I don't discard those 2 cards, this is meaningless. It might as well be that. Then, based off of the results of my roll and any partial successes that I decide to convert into successes, I get to resolve actions based off of what is on the action card that I'm playing. If I roll 2 fails on this particular action card, I've got 2 choices. If that's what I'm resolving, is to move up to 1 space, I will have to lose 1 health, which means I lose one of these tokens. It goes away. And I lose 2 time right here. Or I could opt to not move at all and just pay the penalty of the 2 time and not lose that health. Those are my options on that total failure. If I roll 1 success, then I can move 1 space, and I only lose 1 time to do it instead of 2. If I roll 2 successes, I can move up to 2 spaces, losing 1 time. And that is the gist of how that works. There's a whole bunch of iconography to go over here really quickly. I'm not going to go over every single card, but I'm going to look at all of the different iconography that is possible on these cards. Obviously, the hearts are your health. So if it's this kind of a heart that doesn't have a line through it, that means I can gain health. However, I cannot gain more health than my starting value. So, if you notice, my final girl starts with 6 health. That means 5 heart tokens plus that 1 black heart token, health token, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. That's what I get to start with. I cannot exceed that health value. So at this stage in the game, it would be completely pointless for me to take a rest action like that, because I cannot gain more health than my starting value. That's what that icon means, though, is you gain health, so you can regain health that you've lost. This icon right here, the hockey mask, means you increase the horror level, which we talked about a second ago. To increase the horror level, you simply advance the killer pawn, meeple, here, 1 space on the horror track. So that's that icon. The hourglass we talked about, the red hourglass with the arrow underneath it, and sometimes there'll be a number next to it. If there's no number, it's simply 1 time. You lose 1 time. If there is a number, you lose that much time. A green hourglass means you get to gain that much time. And there is a note in the rule book. The developers are aware that that's not how time functions. But it's kind of symbolic as to how well you are managing your time. That's the idea. Obviously, a heart with a line through it, that means you lose health. We talked about that already. The hockey mask with a line through it, that means you lower the horror level instead of raising it. And I think the only other iconography to talk about are these little comic book POW symbols. If you're in the same space as the killer, you can take an attack action with one of these types of cards, and you deal damage to the killer. In other words, remove that much health from the killer, depending on how many of those little POW symbols there are on whatever you're resolving. Also worth mentioning, some of these action cards, like the close call here, this is not played the same way as all of the other ones where you've got to roll dice to resolve stuff. This is in response to a roll. This one specifically, you get to re-roll dice. Either re-roll any 1 die at the cost of that close call card, or re-roll all your dice, but you also have to, in addition to discarding the card, you gotta lower your time by 2. These 2 cards here are, since they have a blue background, that indicates that they are reaction cards. I cannot play those during the action phase of the game. Those are played in response to what the killer is doing, essentially. That's the gist of that. That'll all make sense as we get going. So that's the action phase. I get to play as many cards as I have as I have in my hand that I want to play. However, and it's also worth mentioning that even if the time gets all the way down to 0 and I still want to play a card that might cost me some time, I can still do that. I can still take that action. If the time hits this red spot where it has this little stop sign with an X through it, or if I take an action that ends up resolving with that little stop sign, then my turn is done after I finish resolving whatever action I'm in. At that point, my turn is done. I can't do anything else if it hits this spot. If it's still here, I can still do something if I want. But if it goes down to there, I'm done. I may not want to spend all of my time, though, because after the action phase is the planning phase. During the planning phase, I get to go shopping. I mentioned that I start with these 6 cards, but you've also noticed, perhaps, that I have been showing off all of these action cards. When I get to the planning phase, I get to spend whatever time I didn't use during the action phase buying cards from the tableau. I can have as many as 10 cards in my hand, which is really hard to do, honestly, to get to that many cards. And I can spend time on whatever cards are here that I'm interested in buying. Now, what they recommend you do in the rule book, when you play cards, you put them face down on the table in front of you so that you don't mess up, because any cards that you get played will eventually make their way back to the tableau, but they don't make their way back to the tableau on the turn that you play them. So, you play them face down to the table in front of you. When you get to the planning phase, you do your shopping, and when the planning phase is done, when you're done shopping, you reset your time back up to 6, since that is the starting time value, and then you get to move all of the cards that you played during the action phase back to the tableau. If it's any of these cards that start in the tableau, you just put them back in their respective stack. Any of the starter cards with the 0 cost, you get to put all in one stack. And when you go shopping, you can always buy these 0 cost cards as long as you're not above your hand size limit of 10 cards. When the planning phase is complete, we move on to the killer phase. First thing you do, you resolve that. That is the target. So that is telling you that the killers are going to deal damage, 1 damage, that's what that knife means. Killers deal 1 damage to the closest final girl or victim. But there's no movement happening on this icon, so that means they gotta be in the same space as the killer in order for them to take any damage. That icon is the attack icon. The boot is the movement icon. So, we'll resolve this first, then we reveal the terror card and we resolve that. The terror card in this instance, so there's the other icons to talk about. The first thing you do is targeting the closest final girl or victim, the active killer. This is a special thing for the intruders since there are 3 killers. We take a look over at the intruders board. Whichever killer has this token at this point, that is the active killer. Looking at that terror card, our active killer, the red one right now, will target either the final girl or the victim, or the closest victim, whichever is closest. On a tie for victims who are closest, it's whichever space has the most victims, and I think you get to determine as the player what the tiebreaker is after that. So, closest final girl or victim, they move towards. Movement is based off of the bloodlust track that is on the intruder board. Over here, bloodlust is tracked right here. This little track right here. At the start, anytime you see a movement icon, they move 1 space. Anytime you see an attack icon, they deal 1 damage. But as this advances, that gets worse. They move further, they move faster or further, they deal more damage every time they attack. So it's bad news. I'm just gonna move this card over here where we can see it all at the same time. So we'll resolve things. So we target the closest victim or final girl, we move 1 space, we attack, and then this icon means we move the active killer token down 1 space. Oh, sorry, no it doesn't. That's the next icon. This icon just means after we've resolved that, then we move on to resolving this row. This says we move the active killer token up 1 space. That's special iconography for this set of killers. We targeting the final girl now. That's what that icon means. This killer on the board will move 1 space and then deal 1 damage to the final girl. Then we move on to this step. says we'd move that up to the next killer. That killer then targets the closest victim and moves one space. Like I said, the terror deck is comprised of cards from both the killer and the location. So if it's stuff from the location, it's not going to activate all 3 killers. Okay. Anytime a victim is killed... Oh, and that's something I didn't talk about. Damage dealing. Obviously, if they're dealing damage to the final girl, that's going to take away from my health. Right here. If I take 1 damage, I lose 1 health token. It goes away. If I get down to just this health token, I will reveal it, and depending on what icon is on the other side of that token, either in a true classic horror movie fashion, I get back up, I get a second wind, and I get to keep going with 1 to 3 health, depending on what's on the other side of this token. Or I'm dead. Because it could be blank. Could be blank, it could have 1 heart, it could have 2 hearts, it could have 3 hearts. Depending on what's on the other side of it, I will add tokens back to my board, and I'll replace that white, or that black token with a white one that just looks like this. Once the white token comes off the board, you're dead for sure. When the killer deals damage to the final girl, you simply remove that much health from the final girl's board. If the killer deals any damage to a victim, victims only have 1 health. So it doesn't matter how much damage the killer is doing, that victim is dead. Whenever a victim dies, you take them off the board, you move them to a little pile right underneath this little dead section, and it says right there, every time a victim dies, it's got that little blood spatter. That means that every time a victim dies, you advance the bloodlust 1 space up the bloodlust track. So that's how that's gonna gain momentum and stuff. And it's bad news, which is why, as final girl, you want to rescue victims, which I didn't talk about. During the action phase, when you're moving, anytime you resolve an action that lets you move, if you are in the same space as a victim, which right now I'm not, I started up in this space, but if, let's say I was in, this space right here. If you're in the same space as a victim, and you want to move, you can take up to 2 victims with you. And I do believe you can pick them up on the way. So if you want to move 2 spaces from here, I could go, I'm going to move here, and then I'm going to take both of these victims with me. I believe you can do that. I believe you can pick them up along the way. If you happen to be in the same space as a victim, and that space has an exit icon on it, then you can choose to rescue that victim. Get them out of there. Anytime you rescue a victim, I'm not going to demonstrate with that one because I'll forget to put it back. I'm going to demonstrate with this one. Anytime you rescue a victim, you can put that victim on your final girl card on one of these rescued victim spaces, any one you choose, and immediately gain whatever the reward is there, which is pretty nice. If you get all 6 of these spaces filled, then you get to flip this card over and unlock the final girl's special ability. Her ultimate ability, which is real good. So, you want to try and do that if you can. Also, something else I didn't mention over on the location board. There are some spaces that have a little wrench icon on them. That means if you're on one of those spaces, you can take the search action. This search action card is not available if you are not on one of those spaces. Because if you're, let's say you're in the garage and you take the search action, it says over there, take the top item card of your space, or take the top 2 item cards of your space and choose one, place the other on top face up or underneath face down. In any case, whenever you're resolving a search action like that, you've got to be in one of those spaces that has that wrench, because you then look up at the 3 item piles that are up at the top of the board. Whichever one corresponds to your space, that's the item deck that you're pulling from. I got really lucky on the item card draw here and happened to pull out 2 knives. I feel like that's great for me. Here's another thing to talk about. When the bloodlust reaches this level right here, it says Dark Power. That means we reveal this card. And that's going to give the killer a new ability that is bad news for me. I'd show you an example, but it would give me information, because there's only, I think, 3 or 4 possible Dark Powers, and only 3 possible finale cards. So it would give me information to reveal that right now. I'm not going to do that. I will reveal that when we get to it, because we will get to it during the game. After the killer phase is done, we move on to the panic phase. The panic phase only happens if a victim died this round. But if they did, if any victims died, 1 or more victims died, then any victims that are in the same space as the killer, or killers in this instance, because these guys could end up all over the map, any victims that are in a space with a killer will panic. If and only if a victim has died this round. What that means is for each one of those victims, you're going to roll the die, one of the dice, and move them through the corresponding passageway. So I'd move through the 6 there. If you roll a number, this space is a bad example, but if you roll a number that is not a passageway on that space, then the victim just stays put. And that's the panic phase. There will be occasions where victims will panic not during the panic phase, and that'll be pretty self-explanatory when it happens. During the panic phase, they only panic if they are in the same space as the killer, and the killer killed at least 1 victim that round. After the panic phase, we move on to the upkeep phase. First thing you do during the upkeep phase is you check to see if the terror deck has been depleted. If all of these cards are now face up over here, then we will reveal the finale card, which will give the killers a new thing to resolve every round that is significantly worse than this plus a terror card. It's bad. You don't want it. The last thing that you get to do during the upkeep phase, if you so choose, you can move items from your hands to your backpack and vice versa. I didn't talk about that. When you get items, some items will have a hand icon on them. They might even have 2 hand icons on them. If it's got a hand icon, that means you can only use that item if it is in one of your 2 hands. You can get 2 hand icons next to this space on your board. Any more than that, you gotta start putting stuff in your backpack. Some items don't have a hand icon. That means those can be used directly from your backpack. You don't have to equip them up here first. You can use those without a hand icon directly from your backpack. If it's got a hand icon, it's gotta be in your hand for you to use it. Anytime you pick up an item, you can immediately choose to equip it and therefore unequip something that you're replacing it with. Otherwise, you can only move stuff between your hands and your backpack during the upkeep phase. Only time you can do that. After the upkeep phase is done, you start a new round with a new action phase, and you keep going until either the final girl is dead and you lose, or the killer, or in this case, all killers, are dead as well. Oh, and one last thing I forgot to mention about those little special health tokens here. The killers also have those, by the way. Each one of the killers for the intruders has one of those. If you get either the killer, well, if you get a health bar down to where it is just that token, that little heart that's on that token also says +1 die. That means you get to roll 1 additional die during horror rolls if that's all that's left on a life bar. One of the special rules for this killer, however, or these killers, I should say, is you only get 1 additional die no matter how many of these killers are down to their last health, just that health token. If both the killer and the final girl are on that last health token, you get both additional dice. 1 for the final girl, 1 for the killer. With this particular killer, with these killers, even though they've all got their own life bar, you get 1 down to just that token, you get that 1 extra die. You get 2 of them down to just that 1 token, you still only get the 1 extra die. I believe I have covered the gist of how this game is played. It took me way too long to go through all of that. But let's go ahead and get started. Hey, thanks for hanging out. If you want to spend more time with us, do us a favor. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and most importantly, head on over to twitch.tv/BNB Tabletop and give us a follow there. We play board games live every Sunday night at 5 p.m. Pacific Time on a show we call The Board and Barrel. And we like to keep things interactive. You guys can influence what happens throughout the course of a game with our Buff and Nerf house rules. You can also make predictions on how things are going to pan out, play virtual bingo for a chance to win a free board game of your own, and heckle us and stuff from the chat. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you Sunday night.